yourself for one of the most heartbreaking stories out of Chicago. A tiny, 1-month-old baby found lifeless in the back of a U-Haul. Authorities first believed heat and dehydration were to blame, but the autopsy uncovered something far more chilling. Today, we're diving deep into the shocking details and examining the charges brought against the newborn's mother. Joining us is criminal defense attorney Diane Menashe. Welcome to Dark Truths.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? This time, we're heading to Peoria, Illinois. A case that, let me tell you, had us all just, well, you'll see.
Tragic, for sure.
Absolutely tragic. So picture this. It's a scorching summer day, and police get a call about a baby, just 1 month old, found lifeless in the back of a U-Haul truck.
You immediately think heat stroke, right? Sadly, it happens more often than we'd like to think.
Yeah, it's a horrifying thought, leaving a child in a hot car like that. But as the investigation unfolded, things took a really dark turn. This was no accident.
The autopsy revealed the cause of death was actually cocaine intoxication.
Cocaine.
Yeah. So naturally, the focus shifted from a potential accident to a potential crime. The baby's mother, Andrea Lillard, an OnlyFans model, was immediately taken into custody. Initially, the charges were endangering the life and health of a child.
Right, endangering a child. Serious stuff, but then, well, things got even more complicated. Investigators started digging into Andrea's past, and what they found was troubling, to say the least.
They uncovered a history with DCFS, the Department of Children and Family Services. Apparently, Andrea had lost parental rights to another child just 2 years prior, cocaine use, both during and after pregnancy.
So there was already a pattern of drug abuse and neglect.
Exactly. And get this, DCFS was actually already looking into Grayson's welfare too. They knew about Andrea's past. They tried to schedule a visit with her shortly after Grayson was born. She never showed up. So that raises a huge question, doesn't it? Why was she allowed to leave the hospital with Grayson in the first place? Knowing her history, did the system fail this baby, even though they were already involved?
We're going to dig into DCFS's role and any potential systemic failures, for sure. But for now, let's go back to that day, that awful day Grayson was found. The scene itself, the details, they paint a really disturbing picture, a picture of neglect far beyond just leaving a child in a car.
Right. The U-Haul was parked in broad daylight, windows rolled up, for hours. The autopsy estimated Grayson had been dead for 12 to 14 hours.
12 to 14 hours.
Yeah, but Andrea claims she only left him in the truck for a few hours. She even said she'd propped up a bottle for him.
Props up a bottle for a 1 month old baby.
I know, right? It just doesn't add up. It became clear pretty quickly that this was much more than just a heat stroke accident.
So much more.
Huh.
And then there's Andrea's behavior at the scene. Witnesses described her as erratic, agitated, like something just wasn't right. And then a Truth Finder search revealed even more.
Tooth Finder, like a background check.
Yeah, public record search. Turns out Andrea had a long rap sheet. Assault, battery, DUI, shoplifting, charges spanning multiple states.
Wow. A history of impulsivity, disregard for the law. And you combine that with drug addiction, well, you can see how things might spiral.
It's a recipe for disaster. And tragically, this wasn't the only hardship in Andrea's life. Just 10 days before Grayson's death, his father died of a drug overdose.
So this baby in his short life had already experienced so much loss and instability. Horrible.
It's just awful. Given everything that came to light, the charges against Andrea were upgraded. First-degree murder. In Illinois, that carries a potential sentence of 100 years. And this is where the legal side of things gets really interesting. To get a first-degree murder conviction, the prosecution has to prove intent.
Right, intent. But here's the thing. Illinois law doesn't require premeditation for first-degree murder, meaning even if the act wasn't planned, if the defendant knowingly created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm, that's enough.
So in this case, they'd have to prove that Andrea, by leaving Grayson alone in a hot truck with cocaine in his system, knew she was putting him in mortal danger.
Exactly. And remember, we mentioned those text messages from Andrea's father. He specifically warned her about leaving the baby in the truck, said Grayson could overheat and die. Those messages could be huge for the prosecution.
Proof that she knew the risks.
Potentially, yeah. But of course, the defense has options too. They might try to argue that the cocaine ingestion was accidental, maybe through breastfeeding, and that Andrea didn't know it could be transmitted that way.
But she was a known cocaine user. Wouldn't that still be considered neglect?
Definitely. But the defense might try to spin it as a tragic mistake, a result of her addiction, not intentional harm. They might try to use her troubled past, the loss of her partner, her financial struggles, to paint a picture of a struggling mother who just made a terrible series of errors in judgment.
I see. humanizing her, hoping the jury will see her as a victim of circumstance rather than a cold-blooded killer.
Exactly.
And speaking of circumstances, let's not forget about Andrea's financial situation. Court records show she was mainly relying on state benefits and around $500 a month from her OnlyFans page.
OnlyFans. Wow, that adds a whole other layer to this, doesn't it? The pressure, the desperation she might have been feeling.
Absolutely. A single mother, recently bereaved, struggling financially, and relying on a platform like OnlyFans, which carries its own set of social stigmas.
It's a tough reality, and it definitely raises the question. Did those pressures contribute to her relapse? Did they play a role in this whole tragic chain of events?
It's a question we're going to have to explore further to really understand what led to Grayson's death. It's just heartbreaking to think about all that pressure she must have been under. And it makes you wonder, how much did those circumstances play a role in what happened to Grayson?
It's impossible to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation. And it brings us back to DCFS. We were talking about their prior involvement with Andrea and how, despite that, Grayson still ended up,
Yeah, that's what gets me. How could the system fail so badly? What are the protocols, the procedures that are supposed to be in place to protect children like Grayson?
Well, typically when DCFS receives a report of potential abuse or neglect, they launch an investigation. They try to assess the validity of the claims, the level of risk to the child.
So home visits, interviews, background checks, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And in Andrea's case, they already knew about her history with substance abuse, the loss of custody of her other child. You'd think that would be enough to raise some serious red flags.
You would think so, right? I mean, why wasn't there more aggressive intervention?
It's a tough situation, really. DCFS has this balancing act to perform. On one hand, they have to protect children, but on the other hand, they also have to respect parental rights and try to keep families together whenever possible.
So unless there's clear and present danger, they might opt for less intrusive measures, like offering support services or monitoring the situation.
Right. And it's possible that at the time they didn't have enough concrete evidence to justify removing Grayson from Andrea's care. Or maybe they saw her commitment to sobriety during her pregnancy as a sign that she was turning things around. It's hard to know for sure without knowing the specifics of their investigation.
It just seems like a system with so much potential for things to fall through the cracks. And sadly, in Grayson's case, it seems like that's exactly what happened. But let's move on to the legal strategy in this case. We were talking about how the prosecution needs to prove intent for a first-degree murder conviction. How are they going to do that? What evidence are they going to use?
Well, I think they'll focus on a few key things. First, there's the fact that Grayson was left alone in a hot truck for hours. That alone shows a reckless disregard for his safety. And then there's the toxicology report, which confirms that Grayson had a lethal dose of cocaine in his system.
Right, but how do they link that cocaine back to Andrea? Are they going to argue that she intentionally gave it to him?
It's unlikely they'll be able to prove that she directly administered the drug, but they will probably focus on the fact that Andrea was a known cocaine user and that Grayson was being breastfed.
So they'll argue that she knowingly ingested cocaine while she was breastfeeding, and that's how Grayson was exposed.
Exactly. They'll likely bring in expert testimony about the dangers of cocaine exposure to infants, even in small amounts.
And what about those text messages from Andrea's father? How will those play into the prosecution's case?
Those text messages could be crucial. Remember, he specifically warned her about the dangers of leaving Grayson in the truck. The prosecution can use those messages to argue that she was fully aware of the risks and that her actions were a deliberate disregard for her son's life.
It sounds like the prosecution has a pretty solid case. But what about the defense? What strategies could they use to try and counter these arguments?
Well, they're definitely facing an uphill battle, but they do have some options. They might try to challenge the timeline of events, claiming that Grayson wasn't left in the truck for as long as the prosecution says. Or they might downplay the role of the heat and focus on the cocaine intoxication as the sole cause of death.
But wouldn't that still point to neglect on Andrea's part, given her history?
It would, but the defense might try to frame it as a tragic accident, a result of her addiction and poor judgment, rather than a deliberate act of harm. They might also highlight her emotional state at the time, the recent loss of her partner, to suggest that she wasn't thinking clearly.
They might even bring up the breastfeeding angle again, claiming she wasn't fully aware of the risks of transmitting cocaine through her breast milk.
That's a possibility, but it's a risky one. The prosecution will probably counter with expert testimony explaining just how dangerous cocaine is for babies, no matter how they're exposed.
So the defense will have to tread carefully there. What about Andrea's financial situation? Could that factor into their strategy?
It's possible. They could try to portray her as a struggling single mother, overwhelmed by grief and financial pressure. They might argue that her reliance on OnlyFans was a last resort, a desperate attempt to provide for her son, and that her relapse was a consequence of all that stress.
It's a classic defense tactic. Humanizing the defendant, appealing to the jury's empathy, trying to make them question the prosecution's narrative.
Exactly. They'll try to shift the focus away from her actions and onto her circumstances, painting her as a victim of her environment and a system that failed to provide her with the support she needed.
It'll be fascinating to see how the jury responds to these competing narratives. The prosecution with their evidence and legal arguments, and the defense with their emotional appeals.
And let's not forget about the potential bias that Andrea's involvement with OnlyFans might introduce. It's not directly relevant to the legal arguments, but it could definitely influence how the jury perceives her.
Oh, absolutely. We live in a world where people are quick to judge based on appearances and social stigmas.
Yeah.
It's something the defense will have to contend with, for sure. It just adds another layer of complexity to this already complicated case. It really makes you think, doesn't it? About justice, about how complicated it all can be.
Absolutely. It's not always so clear-cut. You have the legal truth, what's presented in court, but then there's this deeper truth. All the pain, the loss, the systemic failures, the human side of it all.
Yeah, no matter how much we analyze the evidence or the legal strategy, there's this profound sadness. A baby is dead, and his mother is facing a life sentence.
And Grayson's family, they're left with this unimaginable grief. And the community, everyone's wondering how this could have happened. It forces us to confront these really uncomfortable realities, addiction, poverty, and the fact that the systems we rely on to protect children, sometimes they just don't work.
It's heavy stuff. But even in the darkness, there's always, I don't know, maybe a little bit of hope. This case, as tragic as it is, it's a chance to learn. A chance to push for change.
I agree. We can learn from the mistakes, from the cracks in the system. We can demand better from our social service agencies, push for more oversight, more funding, better training for the people who are supposed to be protecting these kids.
And we can fight to destigmatize addiction. It's a public health crisis. We need compassion, understanding, and real access to treatment. And we can support the organizations that help struggling families. Just to ease some of that pressure, some of the factors that can lead to neglect and abuse.
It's so important, that support. And maybe even more importantly, we can be more vigilant in our own communities. Be aware of the signs of abuse and neglect. Don't be afraid to speak up if something seems wrong.
We have to be the voice for those who can't speak for themselves. It's been a tough deep dive this time, really heavy. But even in the darkest places, we can find a little bit of light, this spark of hope, our shared humanity, our responsibility to create a better world.
A better world for all children. We'll leave you with this. What will you do to make a difference? How will you help create a world where every child is safe, loved, and has a chance to thrive? It starts with us. Grayson's story, as awful as it is, it's a reminder that we all have the power to make things better.
That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay safe and stay informed.